Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs Dean's Leadership Speaker Series. I'm absolutely so happy to see all of you here this afternoon, and I'm very happy to be welcoming our very own Amber Greene as well. Diversity and inclusion are strategic priorities at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Effective policymaking demands the ability to understand and address issues from a range of different perspectives, working toward a more just and equitable society. To this end, we strive to foster an inclusive, welcoming environment that celebrates diverse viewpoints and cultivates a sense of belonging for all community members. This commitment not only enriches our academic community, but also equips our graduates with the skills to pursue policymaking that is both impactful and fair. With the incoming presidential administration, we are likely to see unique challenges and opportunities in the D&I realm. We are fortunate to have today's guest with us to help sort some of this out. Welcome back to Amber Greene, who earned her MPP from the school in 2012 and currently serves on our advisory council. Amber is the former acting special representative for racial equity and justice at the U.S. Department of State, a position she held during the Biden-Harris administration. Prior to her tenure at the State Department, she served in the White House Domestic Policy Council as a special assistant to the president for racial and economic justice. In that capacity, Amber directed the development and management of President Biden's whole of government racial and economic justice agenda. Amber has held several roles leading policy, media, and crisis communications and emergency management in the public and private sectors. These include positions with the Office of the New York City Public Advocate, the New York City Emergency Management Office, and the country's largest airport system and largest bi-state transportation and infrastructure agency. My sincere thanks to Amber for joining us today, and to all of you for being with us for what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion on advancing racial and economic justice, increasing equity in government investment, public service careers, and more. Before we begin, I also want to remind you that SPIA is a place of constructive dialogues and civil conversations. There are some tips on the screen above that will serve as helpful guidelines. Thank you so very much for this. So Amber, welcome back. It's always a great pleasure to see you. We're in awe of all the great work that you're doing. So thank you for your service as well. So we've been having conversations all day. So just to move on to some topics that we haven't really touched upon. You've been working in this space now for several years, the D&I space, and coming out of federal government right now, if you're giving our community tips on what are the most pressing issues. We know that racial injustices persist. We know that racial inequities persist. We know that there's a lot work to do in this space. But the question for our students is, well, how do we do it? And where can I make the most impact? And maybe even further, in what sort of portfolio or substantive areas should they focus or allocate their efforts? What advice would you give our community?
Well, first, before I answer the question, I just wanted to thank you again, Tina Manning, for being able to invite me. Can you all hear me?
Turn it on.
Not on? Let's see. Give me once. No, it's on. I'm just a little talker. I need to use my New York voice. How about that?
Yes, perfect. I'm kind of make my voice lower. Okay.
You're fine. I just wanted to first, thank you, the entire Princeton community, the entire SPIA community, for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. SPIA really changed my life when it came to the type of career that I have, the type of opportunities that I've been able to be fortunate to have in my space. And so, it's not lost on me what an education at Princeton provides, but more importantly, being able to have that dialogue and open discussion about a lot of tough issues that are affecting our society. So I just want to again thank you and the entire team for your hospitality and for welcoming me here today. And it's so exciting to see many of the students. I know it is pouring down rain here, so glad to see folks here and those that are joining online. So I'd say in terms of some of the issues that we are dealing with right now, we have a lot of conservative courts that are trying to block progress. And so I think that is one of the biggest threats to advancing racial equity in this space. We think about affirmative action. We think about rulings that were specifically designed to address contracting and fairness in government contracting, those programs that have been targets when you look at the amount of people that have actually been able to partake in our society, and without inequities, it's very few.
Right.
So a lot of that is addressing systemic injustice, and that's a lot of the work that I was responsible for doing while at the White House. I'd say in addition to the backlash from courts and those spaces, it's also countering the narrative. That's a big part of what diversity, equity, inclusion is and what it isn't. And so it's about countering false narratives that say that, that systemic inequities don't exist, because we know that they do. Yeah. When Black mothers, Native American mothers, rural mothers die at a much larger rate during childbirth, we have inequities. Right. When we have where Latino families have to take down pictures in their homes to get a fair value on their homes, like those are the inequities that exist. We see, billions of dollars that the government spends, and very few of those resources are going out to the communities that need it most. We see, and we have the data that shows us, here's where inequities exist. Mm-hmm. And also countering the narrative that diversity is a bad thing. Right. When we think about the economic, if you're not, motivated by the moral impediment of the importance of diversity, you can also be motivated by the fact that not being a diverse society that robs people of opportunity can also affect us economically. We were talking a little bit today at lunch about a city study that was done that showed the true cost of racism in our society. So between 2000 and 2020, 20 years, there was a city economist that calculated that the United States has lost about $16 trillion in GDP just for anti-Black racism and discrimination. Wow. That comes in the form of entrepreneurship, where people are not able to access and get business loans, mm-hmm. homes, access for mortgages for homes, mm-hmm. being able to have fair and equitable education. And so you think about all of that work and that lost opportunity that could be realized if we can think about how to remove those inequities and those barriers to opportunity that exist. And so those are the areas that I think are particularly of focus, areas that I think students can think about working in, or continuing to work to address the racial wealth gap, working to ensure that we are addressing health disparities, mm-hmm. focusing on environmental justice. Mm-hmm. When we look at Indigenous peoples around the world, those folks that are at the forefront of the climate crisis, mm-hmm. And understanding the health impacts that come along with that, being able to use your education, your data to put those issues at the forefront. And then obviously, you have the continuous assault on civil rights, voting access, educational inequities that exist. And from the US standpoint, if we are to continue to be one of the most powerful nations, or the most powerful nation in the world, and have that global competitiveness, we have to ensure that we have diversity on all forms. We are no longer just competing here, we are competing globally. Mm-hmm. And that is really important as you think about ensuring that every single person in this country has equal access, has equal opportunity, and no longer has to deal with the barriers that have plagued so many communities.
So in that sense, when you think about like the incoming administration, when you think about the incoming administration, some students might be concerned about whether this is the incoming administration will sort of limit or try to change course in terms of where the D&I efforts should be allocated, and if the administration itself is not committed to fighting systemic racism or structural racism, and maybe some members are not even comfortable using that vocabulary, what advice would you give our students in terms of whether or not they should pursue jobs in public service?
So I think, one of the constant threads we hear is that when it comes to the incoming administration, a lot of folks are saying, well, he knows what to do now. But guess what? We also know what to do now too. So that same fight, that same energy that we have consistently brought to address systemic injustice, we know how to do that too. So I encourage all students not to give up, not to give into this moment, to really think about where your voice is, where you will be on this side of history. Will you be on the side where I sit down and I'm not going to say anything, or will you be on the side that really thinks through how do we make life better for everyone, not taking back and rolling back opportunity. It's no secret, we see the discussion on the policy reversals and the work that the Biden-Harris administration has done, which has actually proved to be quite equitable in terms of economic recovery, focus on thinking through the educational inequities. that exist. And so it really needs to just think about the vigilance needed to ensure the protections for our communities. You know, we think about the main groups that have been targeted, that will be targeted, you know, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQI plus Americans. There are a lot of people that are on this sort of list of you know, who we want to strip rights from. And that's not the way to be. That's, if anything, that weakens our country. When we think about ways that we can be better as a nation, removing opportunity is not one of them.
Right. And it's interesting, Amber, that you say that in terms of making sure that, you know, our communities, our students, you know, our policymakers are sort of focusing in on, you know, the institutions of law and legal norms to ensure that rights remain intact. We were at a dinner conversation recently, and the consensus was that even there, though, there are limitations, and a lot will come down to how law is going to be interpreted. So that's another sort of area that we want to talk about. But it was what was really sort of eye-opening in that conversation is that how law is interpreted will often come down to the agency behind the people who are doing the interpretation. So we need people in the room to be sort of, you know, advocating for our norms and our values and those values that we hold dear. So let's, if you don't mind, transition over to the elections, Amber. We've had many conversations since November, early November, about the election outcomes, and they're all different sort of pundit opinions about what happened, what transpired, what went wrong with the Democratic Party, what Trump did very well. And everything's on the table from like policies, economic policy, economic situation, pocketbook voting, to, you know, was the strategy or the coalition that Kamala Harris built around an anti-Trump coalition, was it effective versus the fact that, you know, she only had 100 days to do that? So there are a lot of explanations. While you're looking at it right now, if you were sort of grading the Kamala Harris campaign in terms of what she was able to accomplish, where would you give her positive points? Because we're all looking at what went wrong. So there are some positive points. But also another topic, and I think a lot of people are hesitating to talk about this, right? Which is the fact that Kamala Harris would have been the first woman, but the first Black woman to be president of the United States. Was this a factor that played into her not being elected?
I think so, you know, first in terms of you know, the history of this country and when we have, you know, presidential campaigns, I think she did a phenomenal job. Having 100 days to unite an entire party, raise $1 billion, the most of any campaign in the history of this country, be able to unite that and do this in such a way that turned out as many voters as possible when they may not have, you know, felt the need to be there or didn't have the confidence in the Democratic Party. I think, unfortunately, the outcome was what the outcome was. You have a portion of this country that is still motivated by racism and sexism when it comes to using their voting power. But I think, you know, ways that we are thinking through what next steps are is to really think how we are addressing the issues of progressives, independents, Republicans as well, and really thinking about what we do for the benefit of this nation. It's not just, you know, only issues that affect, you know, Democrats. It's about thinking through where do we take the next steps. And in terms of, you know, I don't necessarily think I wouldn't be, you know, in the right place to give a grade, but I'd say she did a damn well job of doing this and putting this together under the circumstances that she had. And also just, you know, we can't let the argument be just about economics, that people weren't motivated or not motivated to vote by economics, because our economy is actually strong as it's at. Fortunately, we have inflation and we have corporate greed and the things that make it so that people don't feel the impact of the work. But at the end of the day, we still have a lot of folks that voted because they did not want to see a woman. They did not want to see a woman of color in that position. And that's unfortunate for us. It's unfortunate for the rest of the world that that wasn't something that we could see this time around.
And if you, now knowing what you know, and this is unfair questions, but now knowing what you know, and if you were giving Kamala advice, given what the background of what you just sort of outlined, would you give her any other advice if she was going to run the campaign again?
I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Well,
I think, in terms of advice that I would give is to be able to engage a lot of the people that may not have seen themselves reflected in the issues of the Democratic Party. Younger people, people that were, affected and impacted by what's happening in the Middle East. Those are the issues that a lot of people may not have felt a connection to being able to exercise their vote in those spaces. So I think it's important to take a step back, listen, get into communities, really understand, what's driving people when it comes to the issues that they most care about, but also find ways to give people an opportunity to get involved. I saw so many people volunteering and so many people that hadn't, participated in the election process before that were like, you know what, I'm doing this now. I'm hopping on a bus, I'm going to train, I'm knocking doors, I'm doing all these things. And that's wonderful that you have people that want to be part of the democratic process. And not just, doing this because they wanted to, post on Instagram, I was out here, but doing this because they actually genuinely care about our country. And that's something that I think you see in Vice President Harris and President Biden, that a genuine care for this country and not doing things in such a way that you're creating policies that are trying to specifically harm people. And that's the thing that I worry most about the incoming administration, the fact that people really are motivated by division, but motivated by removing rights, but rolling back opportunity, because they think that it's a zero-sum game for America, and it's not. There is a place and enough room for everybody to participate. And if you think that excluding people is going to make our economy stronger, going to make our country stronger, that is not what's going to happen.
thank you for that. I mean, and that's a very insightful point, that exclusion can be also very costly as well as a strategy. So I want to switch over to your own career in public service, Amber. At some point you'll be writing your own autobiography down the line. How were you inspired to become a public servant, and what other pathways would you have taken?
Okay.
Yes.
So, funny question. So, I was either going to work in some sort of politics ever since I was little. I was always interested in working in the government. I just always was fascinated by it. Or I was going to become a singer, but that didn't happen. So I settled working at the White House, which has been a great experience. But I was actually, my grandmother, who's 98, she's watching. She motivated me in terms of the work that she was doing. Seeing the sacrifice of my mom and my family and the sacrifices that they put into us. And so coming from the Bronx is where I'm from, and I saw the inequities that exist in terms of who has and who doesn't. And even in going to different neighborhoods, for a portion of our life, a small portion, but back and forth, we would go between like public housing to visit my grandparents, and then come back to our neighborhood. And you just saw like who had and who didn't. And it was always confusing to me because I was just like, well, why is this like this? This is as a child, right? But then it was when I was in high school, and I went to school in New York City during the Giuliani administration. And there was a police-involved killing of an unarmed immigrant named Amadou Diallo.
Yes.
And that sort of was my moment, that some people here had a moment where they, so the murder of George Floyd, and were just like, what is happening? For me, it was the murder of Amadou Diallo. He was coming home from work. He was, again, unarmed. He was going into his building, and he was stopped by, what was the name of the unit? It was like a plainclothes police officer, and who later the DOJ found that they were engaging in discriminatory practices, racist behavior. But he was coming home, stopped by the police. He went to go get his wallet out. Police officer shot him, which then ricocheted, like later finding out, ricocheted the sound, and then he fell back from shooting his gun, which then caused the other officers to shoot him. Amadou Diallo was shot at 41 times, unarmed. 19 of those bullets struck him.
Wow.
All of the officers were acquitted. That was my moment when I said, I want to be a part of the process to change things, because I just saw that injustice. And I just was outraged and appalled because you clearly see, this person wasn't doing anything, wasn't committing a crime, wasn't doing anything, but he didn't get home that night. And you see so many other people, and this is consistent. You have people that should not be in these positions that are using their authority to abuse people. We see Sandra Bland, we see so many people that are unnamed that we don't know about, that we'll never know about. And so when you think about the systems of injustice and inequity that are rampant throughout our country, that's what motivated me to say, what can I do to be part of that process to change that? And that was my moment for me. And where I found that I wanted to, use whatever I could to try to repair some of the harms that have occurred.
And if I may, Amber, this is building on that. Sometimes like trying to affect change from within the very institutions that have propagated the injustice is a challenging experience. And sometimes you be fortunate to find yourself in conversation with like-minded people, and sometimes you're not. How do you deal with that? Where people sort of question, well, what are you doing here?
So we were talking a little bit about this with some of the students, and I actually just simplified it to interpersonal skills and communication. So my undergraduate degree was in communications. My graduate degree was in public policy. So I was always of the mindset of, you have to come up with great policy, but you gotta learn to sell it. So unless you can come up with the best policy, the best memo, the best proposal, if you can't sell it to people, it might as well just sit on the shelf. So that's what motivated me and thinking through like what motivates people to make change in those decision making. And it really comes down to their interpersonal skills, the connection to the work, how they see themselves reflected. And so I encourage all of those students that are thinking through like, I have this idea, I'm trying to figure out how to move it forward. Understand what the other side thinks, what motivates people. I always tell people, I've obviously worked in the public sector, but I've also worked in the private sector. And what motivates the private sector is quite different from what motivates people in the private sector. So it's really important to know like what values people have, like what are the things that align with their business interests? What are the things that align with their ways that they've experienced life? And having those one-on-one conversations with people that may not look like you, I think is really important, may not have the same values as you, so you understand like, what could bring this person over? Or how can my policy be tweaked to be able to fit some of the things that they're also asking for? I'm always of the mindset, and we talked about this a little bit today. I don't think you should just have one party in control of everything. You need a healthy dialogue. Unfortunately, in this country, we don't have a healthy dialogue, but you need that debate because people often say like the best decision is when everybody, has something that they've given into. And so that is the best decision. So you may be getting discouraged and you're trying to bring people along. I'd say the interpersonal skills are important. Also data. Data is really important. You cannot think, I see some smiles, I see some data people in here.
There's no shortage of data around here.
Exactly, you wanna think through how you're visualizing and telling those stories. I'm not a data person, but I'm able to take what you've given me and now translate that into something that people can understand. Again, big plus for the policy folks in here because that's a lot of what we do is communicating and like making things translatable to people. But being able to show, again, I go back to the work for the work that we did at the White House and also at the State Department. One example at the State Department was when, and so I should probably just back up 1 second. And
please, Amber.
So the president's executive orders on racial equity and support for underserved communities, that was the first executive order that President Biden signed. And what it did was supercharge agencies to think through ways that they're addressing barriers and disparities in their programs, policies, the way that we allocate resources. And it was the first time in the history of this nation that we've done something like that. So it is really, when you think about it, not just drilled down to like a plan that an agency may put together, but it's really the change management that occurs. And so one example of that, and there's tons of examples, if you go to whitehouse.gov/equity, big plug to my old job, you can take a look to see what agencies have done. But I'll give an example on the global side, because a lot of folks in here are international relations students in that space. So one example is we had a farm worker visa program in South Africa. And this farm worker visa program is supposed to be able to ensure and improve economic opportunity for people that are in the farming industry and in those spaces. And when we took a look at the data to show who was actually getting those visas, it was sort of lopsided. So the population of South Africa, of white South Africans, is probably about a little over 7% of the population. When you actually saw who got the visas, it was about 90% white South Africans.
Wow.
So you make up 7% of the population, you have 90%
Of the visas.
There's an equity that exists. Now, is it bias? Could be. Is it that there was not enough outreach done? Is it that the information and program was only targeted to a specific group? All those things are the questions that you ask.
Right.
And so we found those inequities and addressed those programs. But there's tons of stories like that. There was another, and I'm going to mess up the name of the medical test, but there was a medical test that was used to determine hidden disease.
Right.
And so the disease overwhelmingly was not, there was like a different factor that was used for Black men, or Black people rather. And so when they made the change, more people became eligible for the kidney transplant list. Think about how many people probably died in waiting because of a test that was not designed, that had this bias built into it.
Wow.
So those are life-changing things. Like you talk about work, but there are also decisions that this country has made, things that we use on a day-to-day basis to determine who gets what, that can also be very life-changing.
Right.
So those are the ways that I think, you can use data to show and make the argument, and to show people that may not be looking at equity from a standpoint of the moral and social impediment of it, but what's right for an agency, the country, how this addresses some of those issues. Mm-hmm. And I'm always a big proponent of visualizing information where possible, and just figuring out a way that you can make data more accessible, because that is really key in winning hearts and minds and making people understand. Like, I think one of the things that we could have done better as an administration is communicate some of the work that we've done, so that we understand exactly like what this policy does and like how it impacts people and who it's intended to. And we did a lot of that. But in some spaces where things matter to people, but at kitchen table issues,
right,
I don't necessarily think that people understood all that we had been doing to address those inequities. And I think a big plus for us was like the American Rescue Plan, which no Republican voted for, unfortunately. That provided enormous success, lifted Black, Latino children out of poverty, rural children out of poverty, lowered the unemployment rate, created 60 million jobs. Like, there are a lot of things that we did it as administration that most people don't know about. And I very much worry that the next administration will try to claim credit, because a lot of these resources that President Biden and Vice President Harris were able to move forward will be felt for the next decade. Bipartisan infrastructure law, bridges, tunnels, all of those things are being built now. Inflation Reduction Act, money getting into communities. We will see this for a long time. And I want to, one thing, if Vice President Harris decides to run again, I hope she takes credit for that, because that was her team as well. The entire White House pushing that information forward and getting those resources out to communities.
So Amber, on this point, I'm going to come back to another point that you raised, but on this particular point, a lot of commentators have been saying, yes, information wasn't put out about the tremendous efforts, the American Rescue Package, the inflation package, infrastructure package. Why was not, and I know people mentioned it wasn't communicated in the campaign, but truthfully, I don't have any sort of objective measures, but these weren't points that the Biden administration was putting out there. What was going on there?
Well, I would say, from my standpoint, the money is getting out to communities now. And so we were putting out a lot of information, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it was getting out and covering the media. They were too focused on debate performances as opposed to what the president had actually been doing, to be quite honest and fair to that point. Tons of information that was going out to state and local mayors. There were also a lot of, unfortunately, Republican districts that have these funds that are not pushing dollars out to communities too, and withholding those abilities. So there's things definitely we can learn. I definitely agree that making things more easy for people to understand of like how these programs are benefiting their communities. But at the end of the day, I think the issue of inflation and the amount that people were spending, seeing their dollars being eaten up. I remember, you go into the store and it was called shrinkflation, and like what you bought before is now shrunken down, and you're like, what's happening.
Exactly.
I think engagement with the private sector was happening. But there's a lot of corporate greed.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. On that point, you talked about the importance, especially for our students, and before I move to two other questions before we open it up, I'll try to sort of merge the questions, but you talked about the importance of sort of knowing your audience when you're in conversation. And so in other words, you could have the same goal, but maybe have 4 or 5 different ways of pitching the idea, depending on your audience. And it sort of aligns well with what we try to teach here in the school in terms of, how to best make your case on your policy position. However, for some, right, Amber, some people say, and oftentimes I get this comment, is that why is it the same people always having to strategically figure out how to make their argument with an audience that might be less sympathetic? In other words, are we always asking the same people to sort of needing to be more strategic? And if only they were more strategic, they could have probably gotten more. Well, all the while they're already very disadvantaged. Let's say minorities, for example, right? Right, and so
why do you have to do double work to try?
Well, yeah. Is it fair to keep asking to do the double work over and over, and even further, right? And I'm just gonna, I sometimes listen to my students, and they'll say, I'm not interested to be in a job where I have to compromise my values.
Well, I don't think any job you should have to compromise your values. If that's the job that you have to compromise, then you probably can't sleep at night, and it's probably just going to cause you more angst. And it's probably best that you think about, other opportunities. Because your mental health, your spiritual well-being, all of those things are very important. But there is a great opportunity that you have as a person of color, but also thinking about just any lived experience that you have where you can benefit and educate other people on issues. That is a great responsibility. It gives you an opportunity to be able to change someone's mind, educate them about something else. I think we need to be able to create more spaces so people can ask the hard questions and the tough questions that they may not be able to. Do I think it's fair that, I'll give an example when in my previous work in the private sector where working as a vice president in public relations, working on crisis comms and risk communications. But then I also take on a role to try to ensure more diversity, because at the time I'm like less than 5 of actual African Americans that are in an office of thousands of people and the VP level. Is that fair that I have to do that? No. But I see it as my responsibility, because if I'm not there, who else is going to do it?
Right.
That is a big burden that a lot of people have to bear. It's also a burden that companies should be thinking about compensating people for. There are some companies that, in addition to serving in their regular job, doing the work and the job that they've been hired for to do, that they may take on a specifically, as an example, a DEI role. And that's outside of their work. Why are they not compensated? What other place or other type of work environment are you asked to take 2 jobs and only be compensated for 1? That's not fair. So I think if you're going to ask people to do that work, you better pay them. You better think about how you can compensate that work, because that essentially can sometimes be kind of a part-time job. I remember when I was working in the private sector, I would do my work and I'm traveling, I'm doing different things. But then I was also advising our CEO at the time of how to, because he was our executive sponsor, and I specifically took that role because I wanted to make sure I had the ear of the CEO of the company to say, hey, here's where we are, here's our numbers, here's who has advancement. And, we presented to him, here's where our diversity looks like.
Right.
Here's where it's concentrated, here's who's had raises, who hasn't. It is not a fair burden. I'll give one other example, if I can, of my work in New York City, because a lot of folks here may be thinking about working in state and local government. Big proponent of that. I think that is where you will have the most power over the next 4 years in terms of individual policies that are going to impact people on a day-to-day basis. So state and local government, get ready for some resumes from some Princeton folks. But still, federal government is a great place to be, and I encourage people to apply there, because you'll still be able to make change.
Right.
Administrations are temporary. Everything in this life is temporary. I always say everything is temporary except God. So this will pass.
Right.
4 years will go by and it'll be a blip, right? Prayerfully. And you will move on and you will find different ways. But an example, when I was working in New York City, I went to get, and this actually involves some SPIA students, so that's why, or SPIA alums. I was working in New York City and I was a big proponent of pay equity.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you got to pay people. Like, I'm all about pay people, what they're worth and the work that they're doing. And I went to the chief of staff at the time and I said, hey, I want to make sure that this person gets a raise. And his immediate question to me was, what did she make before? And I said, it shouldn't matter what she made before. Pay her what you should. And so anyway, we got back and forth, all these things. I said, I'm gonna fix them. So I started to research some things. I had a wonderful intern who was a SPIA, I think she was an MPA 1 at the time or 2. Hong Van, if you're there, I'm watching you. And we were having a conversation, me and my other colleagues, and we started to think through, like, how can we change this? Like, if this is an issue that's affecting my staff member who I want to get a raise, this has to impact other people. So we started to research, and I was like, there should be a law against asking people what they made. You shouldn't be able to ask people what they made on interviews. You should just pay them. And so we started doing some research, and Hong Van was like, hey, I found 2 bills of a potential law, one in California, one in Boston at the time. This was in 2014, 2015. And so I was like, you kidding me? I was like, there's a law, like we can do this? And so what did we do? We drafted New York City's salary history ban law.
Wow.
Became a law.
Wow.
In 2015, 2016. That then became a state law.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think earlier this year, the president, or rather the administration, had a rule change for the Office of Personnel Management. And now for federal jobs, you can't ask people what they made.
What their previous salaries were.
And so that's an issue of equity, but I say that to say, as you all are thinking through, like, what types of changes that you can make, start with the things that impact you. My thing was, I wanted to get a raise for my staff member. I was given the runaround. I presented them with data to say, here's our salaries. Look at it. Show, like, and it was clear who was getting paid and who wasn't. All the people of color were paid less.
Because their salaries were lower coming in.
Salaries were lower coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an idea to change things, find yourself, again, some fellow SPIA colleagues to help with that work. But I say that in all seriousness of, think about how you may have been personally impacted, or people that have been impacted by inequity and discrimination, and then figure out ways that you can work to address those things systemically.
And it speaks to the importance of being in the room, being in the debate, being in the conversation, and pushing forward, rather than not. I mean, so my last question, I want to open it up for Q&A, Amber, is leaving the federal government, what was the one thing that you will look back always and say, I'm so glad I was there, I worked on this, I'm so glad it's in place? I mean, of course, you have so many accomplishments, but the one that, the one that will shape future generations, and walking away also, conversely, what's the one item or one factor that, or area you wished you had been able to make more progress on?
Okay. So, I'm thankful for all the experiences that I had. I mentioned, my dream has always been to work at the White House.
Yeah.
And so being able to have that experience to me was like, oh my God, like, I can't believe I did this. But then it was like, oh my God, this job is like nonstop. Oh, it's like, it doesn't turn off. So I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that I had the experience to work on the Domestic Policy Council. And also to gain the global experience from the State Department, because for me, like, I understood what was happening domestically, but there's a whole world out there of people that are fighting for similar issues with a lot less than we have here.
Wow.
A lot less than we have here.
Wow.
And if you think about the global struggle for full humanity that we all share, you have to know what's happening on the other side. So to me, like, having that experience where I could translate from the domestic to the international side was priceless. I think being able to work and support drafting of the president's second executive order on racial equity was really transformative, because people will boil it down to equity action plans, but it really was change management. It was how do agencies change the way they operate?
Right.
How do they build systems in place, checks and balances, figuring out where they can, providing data points and analysis, and really just learning everything about, I'm not an expert by any means in every single federal agency, but I had to know like where their inequities exist. So it was really interesting for me to find out like, here's what Treasury could do differently. Here's what Department of Defense could be doing. And like working with those experts and those teams. In terms of what I wish I could have done.
That's probably an unfair question, but.
Unfair. I think what I wish well, I'll say two things.
Okay.
And I encourage everybody to do this. I said this a little bit during our one of the student talks that we just had. I wish I would have not had my head down in so much work that I didn't experience like the full White House and like also just like taking coffees and networking, because I was just like, everything racial equity came across my desk, everything that we had to review, president's speech, like everything. So it was just a constant review, and and I just constantly, we were just in paper all day.
Wow.
You write things that the president ultimately says, or you fact check things the president. You got to be.
You gotta do your job. Yeah.
So that I regret from a personal standpoint. So I encourage everybody, as you're thinking through, have those coffees at least once a week. Go meet with somebody else that you haven't went with, even if it's a different like issue. Like that is the best thing, because that way you can learn about things. It's not talking about work; you're just learning about a person. In terms of like policy areas that I wish we could have addressed, was thinking through preservation of history. We did some actions at the end of the administration, but to really figure out ways that the United States could really address its history of injustice and learning about a path forward. Only through learning our history, I think, is when you can actually learn and improve and change the outcomes of that. But if you don't know your history and you don't know the true history of this nation and where it came from, and people are saying, we've never seen this, Trump administration. No, the United States has always had at the core, unfortunately, a system of injustice. That's always been from the beginning of slavery. And so we haven't addressed those issues and what slavery has done to this nation. What the impacting, and the president did, offer a lot of support and apologies to the Native American community, but there's still a lot of injustice that Native Americans, tribes still are experiencing. So those are the areas where I think if we could spend more time ensuring that people are educated about our history as a nation, where we go, so we don't repeat the same mistakes. I think that was one area where I would love to see more progress. There's a whole bunch of stuff. If I was a lawyer, I'd figure out some new strategies to deal with the court. So last thing, just with the policy folks, because a lot of this battle will be in the courts.
Right.
Policy people are very much needed. Lawyers are great. They can translate a lot of it. They can, craft the legal arguments, but they may not be able to communicate in such a way that moves people and that buys the public will and gets, not buys, but increases public will and support a lot of the issues that we want to see changed. So I would say the policy folks have an enormous role to play alongside our lawyers in the fight to preserve our democracy, to ensure civil rights protections stay in place, to ensure that we don't have an erosion of norms that we've been used to and accustomed to. So those are these places.
Excellent. Thank you for those words, Amber. It's really amazing and thought-provoking conversation and inspirational, despite some of the apparent obstacles for the work that you're doing and we're all committed to doing. And with that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. Any questions? Come on.
You got one?
Oh, sorry.
You got a couple?
Over here, so sorry.
Hi, my name is Alana. Thank you so much for engaging in this talk. I'm an MPA too. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about in preserving history, hypothetically, if you could have moved forward with that, what that would look like to you. I don't know, is it pushing funding for like a museum so that like the public has the space to go and engage with long term? Is it maybe, I don't know, creating something within the National Archives? Like what, I guess, like if you could think farther along in that hope, what would that look like to you?
I think as a first, it's, establishing spaces where you can have dialogue. The United States has done a lot on spaces of remembrance. Just what was it, last month or a month before, when I was working in the State Department, I was in Paris at the 30th anniversary of the roots of enslaved persons or enslaved peoples. And so those spaces where you're actually able to see things, being able to digitize a lot of the spaces, I think is important, so you can communicate and make sure that people are not just, people absorb information in different ways. Books are great, podcasts, you have, being able to use, what is the thing called when you, gotta go with being an old person, where you're able to use like virtual reality and things to sort of see places and those experiences, because you can make it in an interesting and engaging way. Shouldn't be boring. But also funding for nonprofits and CBOs. I'm not sure where the House vote landed with the classification of nonprofits that was up. That's a whole nother thing. But being able to provide more funding and support for those institutions that are doing the work on the ground, I think is really important, because oftentimes we go for the big names, which is great, but a lot of the preservation, community preservation happens, on the ground in communities, in spaces, and providing more support there so people know and can be proud of their heritage. I think one of the things that I often contest with is, when we learn specifically about African-American history, we learn oftentimes the beginning of slavery. And I often say, like, we had a whole history before that. And that's the part where I think people don't really see the full humanity of what people of African descent have contributed to this nation and around the world. So those are spaces where I think definitely could see improvements. But again, as policy people, you all can think through the hard stuff.
Excellent. Thank you. That one. Over here.
Thank you for this engagement, Amber. My name is Mohammed. I'm an MPA1, and I'm really excited to ask, because of your background in communications. What I'm struggling with in this moment is figuring out how to trade off on my distaste for social media and really fast, cheap, what feels like sometimes corrosive communication forms, and the need to meet people where they are. I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how to balance those two competing things.
So don't really like social media, but you need to have some sort of voice and education to like influence the narrative. I think you have to, be mindful of how much you're exposing yourself to a lot of the vitriol that's on social media, because a lot of it can just be overwhelming and just like screw up your day in some spaces. But being able to share information, I think, is really important, but also because we have so much misinformation and primarily from, actors overseas and here, in the United States too, we have to continue to counter disinformation and using your own platforms, educating your friends and family about those spaces. A lot of people make their decisions based on what their family says. So if you can find ways that you are sharing information, I think it's important. If it becomes a space where you're just like, I can't deal with it, find a different medium. You can talk to people, pick up the phone. Like we were talking about, like how people just send emails and texts, like have a conversation, host a coffee chat, have a conversation with people that may not look like you, to just share and understand. I know that sounds very like simple, but it's the hardest thing, to just sit with people that you don't necessarily agree with. But that's what we need to do more of.
Over here.
Thank you so much. My name is Consuelo. I'm an international student, so I was checking the webpage, and I saw that you define racial inequity through a national security challenge. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that approach. Like, why is security the chosen approach to define racial equity? And if you could explain more on that.
Well, when you look at racial inequity, countries that have a lot of inequity often are less stable, less democratic, are not able to be as innovative, often suffer from a lot of challenges where you're stifling opportunity and growth. And so that becomes a challenge to thinking about what does it happen to the rest of the world. It often also allows other bad actors to influence what those countries that may be very fragile in those situations to be more susceptible to foreign influence or nefarious influence from other folks. So that's one reason why it's so important that you think through ways to expand and address inequity that exists. From the United States standpoint, when we think about the way that the rest of the world is changing, the demographics that are changing, you want to make sure that you have people that are in positions that can relate to communities, that can speak another language. Like, I hate the fact that I only speak one language. You go to other countries, people speaking 2, 3, 4, I should probably hear people speak more languages. Why are we not like that? Those create those commonalities. And I know that we have like cultural exchanges and people sort of think that as like the lighty diplomacy stuff. That's one of the greatest inroads that you have to forming bonds with various community groups by cultural exchanges in those programs. That's why programs that the State Department runs have to continue, have to ensure that you're providing that voice, because when you have these security challenges, you need to find commonality and understanding and shared experiences. But again, I just go back to the fact that when you don't have that, those places are more susceptible to outside influence that is trying to create more harm than good.
So, other questions? Here, Aaron.
Thank you for being here, Amber. I spent a little bit of time in West Philly before the election, doing some door knocking, and had the opportunity to talk to a young Black woman who had just come from the polling place, having voted for Trump. And she was able to explain a lot of things about a lot of issues. But the common thread was, she said, I even have family from Haiti, and do you know how much money the government gives them when they arrive here? And each mother gets more money for every additional child they have. And she told this whole narrative of wasteful government spending, basically conjuring that whole Reagan era welfare queen narrative, and that whole structural analysis, that whole conception of structural barriers was completely absent. So my question is, have you had that kind of experience, and do you have any advice about how to change the narrative and raise the level of thinking, analysis, discussion around the structural analysis? I think it's inherently more complicated, but essential here.
Yeah, and I've heard that from people. The question, was like countering the narrative of, who gets what benefits and who doesn't. I think one of the things, just specifically when we think about partisanship, Republican governors who were on the border and other places were very specific and intentional about moving people to cities where you had predominantly Black and Latino populations and pitting those communities against one another. You already have a community that is strapped for resources and not getting those full benefits, but also not even benefits, just access, to be quite honest. It's not a benefit, but having access and opportunity for affordable housing in those spaces. And then you see new people, and so this creates this tension.
Right.
That was what it was designed to do. In some spaces it won, in some spaces it didn't. But it is, again, the United States has always been a country, or is, in modern history, has been a country where you're thinking about the humanitarian costs of what it is. We have a lot of conflicts around the world. We have Gaza, we have Sudan, we have Haiti. There's a lot of spaces around the world where people need assistance, generally do need help. And it's important that people understand why those resources may have been pushed out to people, but also to understand the resources that overwhelmingly have gone to more Americans. I know that people may see those differently because that's what's reported in the media. But again, it goes back to the communications challenges of showing, here's what actually we have done as a society to support people. And it's not one way or the other. It's not taking away from someone by, being humanitarian or practicing humanitarian work.
Excellent. Thank you, Amber. Other questions? So we have a few last minutes, Amber. We've already asked you for your advice to our students and whatnot. I suppose, like, reflecting on your own MPP experience here in the program, what were some of your favorite moments?
I think just meeting students from other countries, because I had been so focused on domestic policy. I was so surprised at how much they knew about, even like I worked in New York City, and they could like quote and recite like at the time what Mayor Bloomberg had done. And I was just like, how do you know this? And so it just made me want to learn more about the rest of the world. And I think that was one thing that I took away from my experience, of just understanding and thinking like, I'm from New York, every community is represented there, like I know everything. And then being like, damn, I really don't know a whole lot about the rest of the world. So I think, being at Princeton and having this experience really opened my eyes to there's a big world out there and there's so many issues. I think other things that I found, particularly helpful was just the support of the school. And if you want to get involved, you can get involved. If you don't, you don't. I'm also surprised at how many people also don't know about this program still, which is like
the MPP program.
MPP and MPA program too. That it is fully funded, thankfully, that you can go get a policy degree. It's still news to some people. And so I hope to be able to share with more people like the importance and the opportunities that exist with Princeton. Because it is truly a special place. I know a lot of people have a lot of choices to go to other schools. I was fortunate to have some of those same choices, and I felt at home here. It's a small program, but you create lifelong friendships. You are able to work very closely on issues that you care about. I love that you all have expanded the curriculum into new areas, new professors, new issues that hadn't been talked about. And yeah, I'm very grateful this afternoon.
No, we're and the school's a much better place because you were here as well. Last question. For our students who will be taking on internships or summer internships down the line, like what advice would you give them in terms of making the most of those experiences?
Okay, so I have my list because I need my notes. I don't have the best memory.
Excellent.
So I talked about the coffee chats. I think that's really important. Figuring out how you can learn more about like writing and storytelling of your work, I think is a really important skill that we didn't really spend a whole lot of time on because we were, focused obviously on the policy development, but again, selling the idea and learning that space. When you're in the intern,
and you talk about storytelling.
So being able to share what the impacts are of the work that you're doing, how it helps people, being able to sort of show the trajectory of an issue so people understand it, especially when it comes to helping people understand from the foreign perspective, like why foreign policy should matter to everyday Americans,
right?
Because we don't always see that. So I think that's one issue I would say of, storytelling. Where was else my notes? I had a whole bunch of stuff for everybody. And then, in terms of other things you should be thinking about for your internship experience is, learn just new skills, not being afraid to ask the tough questions. My mom has always taught me, always ask because someone can either say yes or no. And that's the only thing that I've gotten jobs because I've asked people and either they're going to tell me yes, I have a job, or they're going to tell me no.
Right.
So you shouldn't be afraid to ask. You all have earned your right to be here. You all have done the hard work. So don't let anybody tell you you can't do something. I mean, obviously within reason, but that you have the right. Don't feel like you don't belong. We often carry like the imposter syndrome of like, oh, I'm not enough. You are enough. And whatever you don't know, you weren't.
Right. And it's a life journey in terms of learning. So
and I'll say one last thing if I could.
Please.
And this is, because I always got to put something to pop culture reference. Everybody knows the meme with SpongeBob where he's sort of getting up out the chair, right? It's like he's like, this is not that moment. This is not that moment to say, all right, I'm out.
I'm out.
This moment right now is a moment where everybody's needed, and it may be exhausting. You're like, I don't really know what's going to happen with this administration. It is temporary. Okay? It is temporary. That's why we have a democracy. Things change. So think about the work that you want to do, things that you want to learn, know that your voice matters. I often I have this quote on my LinkedIn, but it's really, sort of helped me. And the quote says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It is not. And that is Dr. Seuss. So if Dr. Seuss knew what was up, then you should have that point too, because everybody has to care about something. And right now, this is not the moment where we throw our hands up and say, you know what, I'm out, I don't care. This is not that moment.
Thank you for those words of inspiration, and thank you for this amazing talk. Thank you all for turning out, and with that, a round of applause for our